Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the dust settles following a turbulent end to Utah's legislative session, and advocates lobby the governor to exercise his veto power. The 2022 election cycle takes shape as candidates officially enter the arena. And Utahns anxiously watch the war in Ukraine as its effects reach our state.
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Michelle Quist, columnist with the Salt Lake Tribune, Chris Bleak, partner with RRJ Consulting, and Lindsay Whitehurst, reporter with the Associated Press. I'm glad to be with you all this evening. We have a lot to get to. Particularly, we're starting with the legislative session. We just had the end on Friday. A lot happened on that Friday that I want to get to. And let me start with some of the stats, which I think is interesting, because people wonder how many bills are actually up there. 1,273 bill files opened. 814 of those were actually introduced. 513 bills actually passed this legislative session, and a few of them, quite a few of them, on the very last night of the legislative session. I want to get to a couple of those because we talked about them on the show. And Michelle, let's start with you on this transgender athlete bill. This is House Bill 11. We had a little preview from it last year. Maybe you can give us a little bit of where we ended last legislative session, and then what happened a little bit in this one.
Well, last legislative session, it was ended as it did not pass. They were going to take the time to study, come to a better, negotiation or middle ground. This year, they were proposing, instead of an outright ban, they were proposing a kind of a board that would, investigate each person that came and each transgender student that wanted to participate in high school athletics. They would kind of decide whether they were, at first, at one point they had wing stature in there, and I think that was removed. It didn't pass. Everybody thought it was dead. The filing deadline for, legislative races passed at 5:30, and then all of a sudden, Senator Dan McCay comes in with a substitute bill that is an outright rejection of transgender athletes' participation in athletics.
Chris, this is interesting. A couple of parts here I want to get to that Michelle just mentioned. One about kind of the change itself. It seemed like when they went to that last night of legislative session, there was sort of a compromise. Neither side was very happy with it, but thought it was maybe going to go. Talk about sort of the politics of what happened there and why Dan McCay made this change, which instead of this commission was an outright ban. And then if there's some legal challenge, then the commission.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to note, is it does have the two-part. And so it's always interesting, I think, when the legislature is deferring to the court. It's my understanding that they were doing that because they didn't feel like they could get the votes to support the commission. But yeah, the politics, I think, are interesting here. In my mind, a good bill has to have the three parts. There's policy, there's process, and then there's the politics of it. And I'm not sure that they hit on all on the right ends there. I think, what you see from our governor, as he talked immediately about a veto, is he's talking about, what is the right policy? I don't know what that is. I think there's legitimate issues and concerns to be discussed and debated here, and not suggesting the commission does that. But the governor, I think, is worried and looking at what is the tone we're setting and what is the image of the state. And that goes into both the politics of that, which people are viewing in a different perspective. And so, interesting challenge. And I think we're going to see a lot more on this bill play out here over the next couple of weeks and months.
I think that's true. Lindsay, talk about what Michelle brought up too, what you heard on the Hill this time. There's a lot of speculation. In fact, quite a few news articles that seem to suggest the legislature waited until after the filing deadline. I want to talk about that for just a minute too. The filing deadline was 5 o'clock on on Friday. These changes happen after. What did you hear from legislators, people on the Hill, about that assertion?
Well, I think one thing to note in the background of all of this as we start this conversation is right now this is a very small group of students that we're talking about. There's 4 kids who have been through, there already is a process if kids want to participate, and it includes a year of hormone therapy. And so there's only 4 students who have gone through that process and are playing in these student sports right now. And there's nothing public, anyone saying that they have any kind of competitive advantage. That's the overarching concern here, is that transgender students could have some kind of competitive advantage in girls' sports. And the folks that support a ban say that's a small group now. In the future, that could change. And there's a lot of conversation to be had around that. There was a full year of negotiations over this issue. But right now, we are talking about a very small group of kids. But for Governor Cox, what he mentioned in his proclaiming he would veto it is that it sends a wider message to a group of students. You don't belong in this very important ritual of American kids. You know, sports are an important thing. Teamwork, playing together. There's lots of other things besides just competition that are involved in sports. And so there's a lot to work out there. It's a very charged issue right now, nationally speaking. You know, it's something where there's a lot of discussion and a lot of conversation about this issue, but it is in Utah, especially, a very small group of students that we're talking about here. And I think one thing that this reflects is that, you know, we really pride ourselves in Utah, the Utah way, having respectful dialogue and coming to some kind of compromise. And I think it kind of reflects when, you know, we have this much more acrimonious national political picture, and that does kind of seep into Utah. And it's getting harder on some of these hot button issues to find something that everybody can live with, you know, and so yeah, it'll be a veto from Cox this year. There will be efforts at a veto override. Whether those will be successful is very much an open question. But I do think there's a fair chance we could see this come back again next year too.
Chris, I want to get that veto or override for just a second. You were chief of staff in the legislature, so you know how this works. People are speculating about whether or not the legislature might try to do a veto override. Just tell us really quickly, how does that work internally? You've been part of it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, leadership has, as they do in all things in the Utah legislature, a big hand in how that gets determined. Ultimately, the leadership needs to determine, do they have the votes? They need 20 votes in the Senate and 50 votes in the House in order to override a governor's veto. And they have to decide, can I get to that threshold? Now, neither body made that threshold in the original vote, and so it would absolutely take some work from the members of leadership to recruit or find those votes in order to get that override. You know, I think it's important to note any bill can be vetoed. You know, we often talk, it's got veto override. It's really just an indicator. Can this? What was this bill? Did it have the votes at the beginning? And this one did not. But it's not that far off either, and so it's certainly within the realm of possibility in my mind.
But even if the veto is overridden, this bill is likely unconstitutional. They know it, and the concern here is that it others. I'm using that as a verb. It others a very small group of kids, of students. And what happens next is really important. I mean, last year, Florida passed this same type of bill. This year, Florida passed, you can't even say gay in the classroom. Idaho just passed a bill that would make a lifetime sentence for parents of transgender kids. This is not the way this conversation should be going. Throughout the session, the conversation was there, the dialogue was there, and the parties from all sides were coming together. This last minute, we're going to do it this way, ram it through, is just not the way it should have been done.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is the time that was spent on this greatly impacted the number of other bills that were passed. I want to get to one of those, Lindsay, because this was a bill that was very controversial going into the last days of the legislative session. The legislature didn't get to it. This is House Bill 60 on the vaccine passport bill. They didn't get to it, but maybe give us a little context on this, because it really motivated our business community to get involved.
And of course, it also motivated some strong feelings from some folks who came up to the Capitol and made those feelings known.
Now talk about that.
And there was one gentleman, I believe, in a hearing who was actually taken away by troopers. Whether he's officially arrested or not, I'm not totally sure, but it's the kind of thing that looked a lot like that at the time. So there's some very strong feelings around this issue. I mean, and that's probably not a surprise to anybody, right? But especially after the Utah Jazz stopped requiring proof of vaccination to come in, it's not something that's terribly widespread in Utah that people are needing to show that vaccination card. And of course, the business owners who do have some level of requirement, felt like this is my private business and I should be able to make these decisions on my own. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. By next year, I don't know, we may be in a different place when it comes to the pandemic altogether, but.
Well, Lindsay made the point earlier about the national politics seeping into this, and this is absolutely what we're seeing here. I think Utah has done a pretty remarkable job in terms of managing COVID. A lot of the things you hear about didn't happen. We didn't define essential employees. We didn't do a lot of other things that other states had to do. And if not for the federal vaccine mandates, I don't think we would have seen this bill. But this bill was seriously problematic from the perspective of, are we going to get involved in private business, the decisions they make, the contracts they have? So I'm happy that it didn't pass, but and hopefully just the air is out of the room now. But certainly a concern from the business community perspective in terms of just how to administer this, how to deal with this, because there are so many things they have to do in terms of making sure their employees are safe, their customers are safe, and managing those risks.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we're not giving Senator McKay the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he meant to pass a bill that he knew would be vetoed in order to have this run out of time so that nobody would have to put a yes or no on it.
Okay, all the strategy involved in politics. Okay, I want to get to the budget for just a minute because this is a $25 billion budget, pretty huge for the state of Utah. I want to get to a couple of those budget items. Chris, I wanted you to describe for just a second this $1 billion put into transportation and transit, because that is going to be a huge thing for the state.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's something that has been not well, I don't mean well reported on, it's been talked about, but this is such a significant step. First of all, $1 billion in cash. And we've done big bonds before, other things like that, but they put $1 billion of cash into transportation. In addition to that, they included money for active transportation, bike, road trails that people can use, and also $150 million, well, it's actually like $280 million into transit, double tracking a front runner and the Point of the Mountain transit line. The state has never put money in transit projects before. So when we talk about multimodal and really changing the way we think about moving people and goods, the state is making a significant investment, and it is unlike anything we've ever seen. And so kudos to the state for moving this direction. We've been working on this for a number of years, and this is the fruition of it, and I couldn't be more excited about it.
Mm-hmm. A tremendous amount of money to education, Lindsay. This is about a 9% increase.
Right, and I think one kind of small piece of that that's interesting to me as a parent is the full day kindergarten. That conversation, not as much money as originally intended did end up going to that, but I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for parents, because it's not an option for everyone to have that full day kindergarten, and it's not necessarily something everyone wants to take advantage of. But I think it's definitely something that's had a lot of conversation. And early on, what are we teaching our kids? What options are there for parents? I think that was an interesting conversation to watch at the legislature this year.
Yeah. Michelle, this conversation goes all the way back to like 2000 when we saw a bill that was put forward for all day K.
Right.
So the funding wasn't quite where it was initially planned, but talk about what might happen next for this.
Well, I like how the data is pushing these bills. The transportation funding, our demographics require it. We're only growing. The kindergarten bill, more women are working full time. Our kids do better if they're in full day kindergarten. Again, it's not a requirement that kids go to full day, kindergarten, but those families who need it or who want it, the opportunity should be there, and it shouldn't depend on what school district you're in. Mm-hmm. And so I love that the demographics of Utah and that the values of Utah are really driving these legislative decisions.
Mm-hmm. One last bill I think is interesting, too, is we've had the discussion in the state about medical marijuana. Lindsay, this year we had a discussion about psilocybin, mushrooms.
Right, and I was so interested to see the way, it was a different conversation than when we first started talking about medical marijuana in Utah. There was a lot of consternation over that, multiple years of conversation in the legislature, finally a ballot initiative before the eventual compromise that allowed medical marijuana in Utah. And this particular bill, it just studies it. It doesn't actually allow its usage yet, but it pretty much sailed through. I mean, the lawmakers are looking at this in a very different way, it seems to me.
And it did come in under the radar. There was not a lot of information about it. I'd like to see the data that's supporting it and who's pushing it and where the money's coming from.
Yeah, we'll follow this one closely. An interesting development. Not a lot of conversation, though, at least in the press. So we'll watch that one closely. Okay, I want to get into the politics of candidacy, because this has been a big week. Chris, talk about kind of this unique situation we had this year. We don't usually have the filing deadline during the legislative session. What kind of impact might that have, and did it have on the number of people who decided they were going to file this year?
Yeah, important to note that the filing deadline is now going to move to the first week of January. So going forward in this session, though that final session going into the election year, people are going to know who's filed against them and what the dynamics are. And I think that does have the potential for really impacting the way some people react to that. I don't know the total number of candidates. I would actually be surprised if it's really that significant of a difference from years past. In fact, I felt like it was a little bit lower. There's often candidate challenges, particularly in redistricting. There's a lot of change moving around and people all of a sudden end up in different districts. And so I didn't think it was that surprising, but there are a couple of candidates that have what look like significant in-party challenges on both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats. Specifically in the Senate, I'm thinking Senator Kitchen has a challenger, Senator Vickers, Senator Milner. There are going to be some interesting challenges there. Yeah, absolutely. And so, but this is the beauty of the process. They can go and defend their record and defend what they're working on and what they're doing, and let the people decide, and we'll see who comes back up.
We will. Michelle, you're a former candidate. I mean, talk about kind of what goes through one's mind when you're doing that filing. Are people waiting for the session? If it goes earlier, how does that impact sort of how people vote? Are people pulling punches because they're worried about challengers?
I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I think it did definitely affect things this year because of the, it was changed mid-session, and, it was, I think it affected things this year. I am a former candidate, a former failed candidate. It's hard to decide whether to go in. And the travesty that I see is those spots that aren't opposed. I think every race should always be opposed. I think we should have conversations and candidates good enough in this state to have a dialogue with each other about ideas and not about personalities.
Let's break down a couple of those points, because we have some. In the House of Representatives, 22 representatives are facing inter-party challengers. In the Senate, 10 senators are facing inter-party challengers, including, as Chris just mentioned, some pretty high-profile members of our legislature. Even they are getting challengers. Talk about that for just a moment, because that's a pretty good number, and we still have quite a few that don't have challengers at all.
This is the time of year where, I don't envy anybody who's in the process. I think they're great conversations, and I'm really glad that we'll be having them both within parties and in between the two parties. I think some really good things and really good conversations can come out of there. But man, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's not this portion of it especially is not a highly paid thing. And so your hat's got to be off to anybody who's getting in that ring at this point in time, right? Just to be able because you put a lot of your own time, a lot of your own money into these races that there is not a massive group of people paying attention to. More people should be paying attention, but not necessarily a huge number of people are getting in the mix. So you gotta respect anybody who's going to go into the ring, who's going to have those conversations and do that work, because it's important.
Power over the incumbent really is hard to overcome. Just the idea of it too. I think the one thing that is still making a difference is the recent change to not have one box at the top that says, one party, Republican or Democrat. I think it makes the voter go through each candidate, and I still think that's really helping.
The other election you didn't mention, Jason, is the State Board of Education. This is its second cycle as a partisan elected position, and there is a lot of challengers in there. A couple of folks that didn't run. The chair, Mark Huntsman's running for the state legislature. I think Laura Belknap withdrew from her race. But there's actually a lot of energy there, particularly as you think about some of the issues around COVID and how parents have felt. And so there's a lot of energy in those races, and now that that it's a partisan election. I think that's going to be interesting what impact that has as we move forward as well.
That's such a good point, because there's so much of the disagreements and conversations we're having as a culture are playing out in schools, at school boards right now, and it's really true. What may have at one point been a kind of a sleepy arena is not anymore, and it's an important one.
Well, it's so interesting. There are 28 people who have filed for those state school board positions. And I think that's an interesting point, too, Michelle, just the last part on this. There was a time when you talk to most people and they'd say, who's on the state board? And they say, I have no idea who that is. Particularly given the issues that happened over the last couple of years, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. There is definitely interest in who's making these decisions.
Yes, there is interest, and there's knowledge of what's going on. Facebook, has really helped to push out certain people, certain personalities, and the ideas that they are bringing to the board, and people are pushing back against that.
Yeah, they are. Let's talk about the Senate races for a second. A lot of interesting dynamics. This is the Mike Lee race. Let's get into that one for just a moment. 7 Republican candidates, Chris, have filed for that particular race. We know some of the names. Some of the names we're just starting to get to know. Talk about what kind of an insider's perspective on this. Why does Mike Lee have so many internal challengers?
Well, I think Mike Lee's high profile, and it's a position that people, to Michelle's point, that people want to have some conversations about ideas and what Senator Lee has been espousing and pushing. Based on my caucus experience, Senator Lee's probably in pretty good shape. I'll tell you one of the things that I found interesting. Becky Edwards was much more mentioned at my caucus down in Utah County than I expected, to be honest. And I thought that was interesting. She definitely had some supporters. They didn't necessarily fare well in some of the caucuses that I witnessed and saw. But yeah, there's going to be some energy there. Clearly, there's going to be a primary. I believe Becky already has the signatures, and there are others that are aiming for that. And so this is going to be a drawn-out race. And Senator Lee's going to have to share his ideas and push what he wants to see accomplished and the direction he wants to go, and people will have the chance to say if that's the direction they want or not.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard to catch the wind of the populace at a caucus meeting now because so few people attend. I had 5 people in my precinct, whereas for the past, obviously not 2 years ago because there wasn't one, but 4 years ago, 6 years, and 8 years ago, there were 50, 60. 5. We had 5, and so I think, Senator Lee's supporters showed up, but Becky's already on the ballot, and I think people are disillusioned with politics in general, with the state of national affairs, with some of the statements maybe Senator Lee has said. And people like change, and they like a good race.
Wow, talk about this good race, Lindsay. There's an interesting dynamic happening in this race that I'm not sure I've seen exactly before. There's a Democratic challenger, Cale Weston, but there's this movement from high-profile Democrats in the state, like Ben McAdams, even like Mayor Jenny Wilson, who are supporting the independent candidate, Evan McMullin.
Right, exactly. That's been interesting to see a couple of very prominent Democrats in Utah. Ben McAdams came fairly early. It was a while back that he came and endorsed Evan McMullin, and feeling like this is the guy who's going to best represent my values as a moderate Democrat. And of course, Jenny Wilson just recently. And so there are some folks who even say the Democrats shouldn't run anybody, so that this race will be strictly between Mike Lee and Evan McMullin. And of course, historically, independent candidates, it's tough. It is, when you're not attached to a major party, it's tough to get that traction. McMullin, of course, is a little bit different because he had this previous run for president where he did quite well in the state of Utah. He has perhaps a little higher profile, more name recognition than your typical independent. Mm-hmm. And of course, Democrats in Utah have, in the minority, always have some kind of a little bit different view on things than a typical two-party, where it's more of a 50-50 kind of split. You saw some self-avowed Democrats registering as Republicans in the past in a governor's election. So the politics of being a Democrat in Utah are always a little interesting, a little bit different, and it'll be interesting to see whether they do end up, really lining up behind Evan McMullin in this one.
I have 2 thoughts here. One is, sorry to cut you off, Michelle. One is, if the Democrats can get their candidate out of the race, I think it does make it a much more interesting general election race, no question about it. But I do want to say, I don't know who Evan McMullin is. And I think he has to do, I mean, he's either going to be defined or he has to define himself, because he's this enigma of, okay, he ran against Trump, he got support because of the dynamics in 2016, but I don't know who the guy is. I don't even know if when the last time he lived here is. And I'm not saying that to knock on him, but he's got to define himself. And there are people that just don't know who he is. He's almost sort of a figment, like, oh, he's this perfect candidate, because we don't really know who he is. So
yeah, this candidacy drives me nuts for two reasons. I'm a rules follower. Like I go by the rules. And yeah, the independent party, he's going by the rules, but that's not the system we usually use. And if anybody's going to jump out and run as an independent, it should have been a woman, not a white male. I'm sorry to say it out loud, but there are enough regular paths for white males to come and show us why we should vote for them. And number two, I want the Democrats to do better. I want them to field a candidate that Utahns want to vote for.
Chris, is there any chance the Democrats try to pressure to not have a candidate? I mean, it just seems so odd that this is even
pressuring candidates to get out is usually not a good strategy, and I'm not sure what they would use to do that. So I would suspect that he stays in. I don't see the reason he gets out, and for the same reason Michelle mentions, I mean, they can't just not field a candidate for the biggest race of this election cycle. That's just terrible for them as a party and their viability going forward.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now we have some of our other congressional districts are up for election too. Maybe Lindsay, let's just talk about that for a moment, because we have, all of them have challengers, which is interesting. The ones that have the most, District 1, Blake Moore there are 6 candidates in that race. 6 candidates in District 2 with Chris Stewart. Interestingly, 10 candidates have filed against John Curtis, and just for the thoroughness, 4 candidates on Burgess Owens. It's interesting, we have so many candidates filing for these races. Any initial thoughts about what we're seeing right there?
Well, and for a long time, that 4th district where Burgess Owens has been the one that is most purple-ish. That's where Ben McAdams was able to win as a Democrat in Utah, which is not a super easy feat. And it's also interesting because he is perhaps the most far right of all of those congressional folks that we have right now. And so it's interesting that he's drawing the fewest challengers, right? So apparently that would perhaps be an indication that that people feel like he's not the one they want to go up against, and so that's not necessarily how you typically think of that district, but it would seem that he's got the easiest path forward so far. Of course, other incumbents like Chris Stewart are quite well established, and it is really hard to kind of overcome that incumbent thing right there, right?
There's one aspect we haven't talked about that I'm curious if you have heard about it from any of the caucuses before we leave this. A lot of these candidates are going to get signatures. We've seen Chris Stewart has not done this when he's been running. Any of you, any undercurrents here about retaliation, or is that even a thing anymore?
No, it is, by one faction of the state central committee on the Republican Party, but they don't ever get anywhere. Signatures is a thing to stay. What's interesting is all these incumbents have new constituents too. I mean, my district changed. I have a different rep now, and so they had to take that into account too. But I think signatures are here.
And I agree with Michelle. Even more so, I think, as we go forward because of the filing deadline change, but tying it essentially to when people are declaring that they're getting signatures or beginning the session, and more runway between that and when the convention/primary happen. If there are people that don't, I think they're going to get signatures. I believe it's political malpractice not to. You should give yourself every option for the people to vote on you, and so I think that's
which is why Senator Lee gets signatures.
Exactly.
Even the staunch ones that were against SB 54 get signatures.
We didn't fight over that issue this year in the legislature. How many? At least the last 2 or 3 sessions we've been fighting over that. At some point in this session, I don't remember it being a fight this year. That's one thing we avoided.
Yeah, an interesting point. I want to end on one note here that happened in Washington, D.C. Something that even our delegation was completely united on was some funding to go to Ukraine. Chris, maybe just give us a little bit on that. $13.6 billion in emergency spending to the crisis in Ukraine. Just a little about what you're seeing and hearing in Utah with the support here.
Well, I'm certainly pleased they did. I think it's important to remember that we had a big battle over funding going to Ukraine just a couple of years ago that led to the impeachment of a president. And so it's good to see people rallying towards this cause now. I think it's been important. And one of the issues that I've cared mostly about is this issue around NATO and making sure that we have a strong defense and that we have a strong alliance. And I'm pleased that it's led to a stronger, more unified NATO, and let's hope that the best for the conflict to resolve and the people of Ukraine.
Michelle, it seems to be something that is supported both sides of the aisle.
Oh yeah, and Utah, the populace supports it. There's no room here for anyone who thinks that it's okay to go and invade a sovereign country.
In our last 20 seconds or so, Lindsay, what you're hearing from people that you're interviewing about this conflict?
You know, I covered the rally on the steps of the Capitol, and it was incredible to see people all together, all united around a single feeling, chanting "No war" and things like that, and that was a cool moment.
Yeah, it was. We're watching this one closely, I know from D.C., but certainly here at home as well. Thank you for your insights this evening. A very important discussion. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. The show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.